Hey everyone, tonight we're not starting with a philosopher or a warlord, but with a plant that's been confusing, healing, and occasionally irritating governments for over 5 millennia, cannabis. Before we settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these late-night dives into history. Drop a comment, too. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always incredible seeing how far this little corner of the internet reaches. Alright, lights down, maybe a fan on for that quiet hum in the background. Let's drift into tonight's hazy bit of history together. We're heading back to around 5000 BC, the Stone Age. Heavy on the stone. Civilization still running its beta test. People are inventing pottery, domesticating animals, and dying from things as simple as standing too close to a mosquito. Somewhere in what's now Siberia, a forager probably tossed some cannabis onto a campfire for warmth, took a deep breath, and immediately forgot why they'd stepped outside in the first place. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncovered cannabis seeds tucked inside ancient graves, proof that someone, somewhere, valued this plant enough to take it to the afterlife. Maybe it was a sacred ritual. Maybe it was just a prehistoric version of, "Don't bury me without my stash." Knowing humans, probably both. Back then, cannabis wasn't about good vibes or deep thoughts. It was about staying alive. Its fibers made ropes and clothing, its seeds filled empty stomachs, and the plant itself was basically nature's first multi-tool, practical, dependable, and everywhere. You could sail with it, tie things with it, wear it, and if you happened to smoke it by accident, suddenly discover that clouds were the funniest thing on earth. Now imagine being one of the first humans to inhale it on purpose. No one around to explain what's happening. No snacks. No Bob Marley. Just pure confusion and a very one-sided conversation with a tree. Early humans probably didn't think they were getting high. They thought the gods had just patched reality with a vision upgrade. But from that accidental puff, a legend took root. A plant that would one day circle the globe, inspire poetry, spark paranoia, and bankroll entire reggae albums. All of it starting with some bored Neolithic farmer who looked at his crops and thought, "What if I set this on fire?" Long before anyone called it weed, cannabis had already outsmarted us. It found the one species foolish enough to cultivate it, worship it, outlaw it, and smoke it, sometimes all within the same century. Humanity, meet your oldest love-hate relationship. Fast forward to around 2700 BCE. China was busy inventing just about everything: paper, silk, bureaucracy, and apparently, the world's first medical endorsement for getting high. Enter Emperor Shennong, the so-called divine farmer. A noble title, until you realize it meant spending his days taste-testing random plants to see which ones didn't kill him. Shennong was, in essence, the world's first drug trial, without the control group. Legend says he catalogued hundreds of herbs this way, from ginseng and tea to, yes, cannabis. Turns out, divine farmers and curious stoners might have more in common than anyone expected. His book, The Pen Sao Ching, reads like an ancient Yelp for plants, complete with reviews. Cannabis, he wrote, was good for pain, gout, rheumatism, and forgetfulness, which is impressive, considering it probably caused the forgetfulness he was treating. To Shennong, weed wasn't a vice, it was medicine. The Chinese didn't roll it up or pass it around a circle. They brewed it into tonics, ground it into powders, and likely gave it names that sounded wise and poetic, something like wind in the bones elixir. It eased fevers, calmed nerves, and made people just confident enough to believe their poetry was genius. By then, hemp was everywhere, twisted into ropes, woven into clothes, pressed into paper. Entire towns were practically built out of cannabis. You could live your whole life surrounded by the same plant. Your clothes, your scrolls, your fishing nets, and, if you were lucky, your painkiller. It was like living inside an eco-friendly bong. And make no mistake, the doctors of ancient China took it very seriously. They believed cannabis balanced the body's yin and yang, which is an elegant, ancient way of saying it helps you chill. It wasn't recreational yet, but let's be honest, every civilization that claims it's using something strictly for spiritual healing eventually ends up giggling at shadows. So, while most of the world was still experimenting with fire pits and questionable decisions, China had already stocked its pharmacies with cannabis. Shen Nong might not have known what THC was, but he knew one simple truth: it made people stop complaining for a while. And in a world of famine, floods, and Mongols warming up on the horizon, that counted as medical progress. Meanwhile, across the open grasslands of Central Asia, China's neighbors had a much simpler idea: skip the tonics, just burn it and breathe deeply. Meet the Scythians, horse-riding nomads who basically lived outdoors, looked perpetually sleep-deprived, and carried an aura best described as armed and unbothered. Around 1000 BCE, they decided their funeral rituals were missing something, mainly smoke. Not incense. Not sage. Cannabis. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would toss hemp seeds onto hot stones inside sealed tents. Within moments, the air grew thick with aromatic haze, and soon after, they howled with pleasure, which, in ancient Greek, roughly translates to, someone's about to freestyle under the stars. This wasn't some casual ritual puff, it was a full-body baptism in THC. Picture 20 warriors, tattooed, draped in fur, crawling into a smoke-filled tent of burning hemp and stumbling out moments later, spiritually reborn and slightly disoriented. The Scythians didn't have a word for relaxation, but this was probably as close as they got. The smoke wasn't just for pleasure, it was sacred. It connected them to the spirits of their dead, softened their grief, and, let's be honest, made the afterlife sound like a surprisingly good time. Centuries later, archaeologists unearthed golden bongs, yes, actual gold, from Scythian tombs, still dusted with traces of cannabis residue. These ancient warriors didn't just get high, they turned it into an art form. They lived and died, stylish, mysterious, and slightly baked. You can't buy that kind of historical commitment. And as word drifted along the trade routes, other cultures caught on. From Persia to India, nomads, mystics, and philosophers began borrowing the ritual, inhaling cannabis smoke during funerals, festivals, and deep midnight debates about existence. Because if you're going to question the meaning of life, it helps when the air itself is giving you ideas. While the Chinese were brewing tonics and writing about balance, the Scythians were perfecting the ancient art of the hotbox. No incense, no chants, just fire, smoke, and an unspoken rule: nobody opens the tent flap until someone starts seeing gods. Meanwhile, far to the south, India decided to make cannabis holy. Because if you're going to inhale smoke and see visions, you might as well make it sound respectable. By around 1500 BCE, cannabis had made its divine debut in the Atharva Veda, one of Hinduism's 4 sacred texts. It was named among the 5 holy plants, said to be a gift from the gods themselves, and favored by Lord Shiva, who, according to legend, discovered it beneath a celestial tree, took a few hits, and achieved an unshakable state of cosmic calm. From that moment on, Shiva became known as the Lord of Bha with Macron NG, arguably the coolest religious title in human history. Bha with Macron NG, by the way, wasn't smoked, it was drunk. Think of it as an ancient smoothie: milk, spices, crushed cannabis leaves, and the vague promise of enlightenment. Priests, yogis, and festival crowds sipped it during rituals, praising the gods, meditating deeply, and occasionally forgetting what they were praising halfway through. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't taboo. It was sacred. In temples, cannabis purified the spirit. In villages, it soothed family gatherings. It was medicine, meditation, and mild escape, all in one divine drink. All in one convenient leaf. Festivals like Mahashivaratri turned into full-blown divine parties, all-night celebrations where worshippers sang hymns, danced, and drank BHA with Macron NG until the universe itself seemed to vibrate in rhythm. If enlightenment had a recipe, it was probably this: 1 part devotion, 1 part weed, and 1 inevitable hangover by sunrise. While other civilizations treated cannabis as a trade good or a tool for ritual, India gave it something more: a personality. Playful, spiritual, and unmistakably human. It wasn't just a plant, it was a companion on the winding path to understanding the cosmos, or at least pretending to. And that was the beauty of it: nobody pretended it was just medicine. It was for joy, transcendence, and occasionally forgetting that there were 10 more years of drought ahead. So, while the rest of the world coughed through their experiments, India elevated cannabis to divine status. They didn't just smoke it, they sanctified it. Because here, getting high wasn't escapism. It was worship. It was enlightenment, with better snacks. While India was joyfully toasting Shiva with BHA with Macron NG milkshakes, China took a more disciplined route. Because in China, even enlightenment came with paperwork. By around 1000 BCE, cannabis had found its way into Taoist ritual life, a curious blend of meditation, alchemy, and doing strange things in caves in the name of immortality. Taoist monks believed that burning cannabis incense helped them commune with spirits and glimpse the future, which, if you've ever tried anything similar, probably looked amazing for 10 minutes and deeply unsettling for the next 2 hours. In Taoist texts, cannabis was sometimes called the liberator of sin, a name that sounds transcendent until you remember it also inspired people to wander off into the woods trying to hug clouds. Monks would burn it during meditation, claiming it opened the gates of perception. Translation: they got so high they could hear their own heartbeat in stereo. China's relationship with cannabis was complex. It wasn't a party drug, it was a philosophical one. The Taoists weren't trying to escape reality. They weren't trying to escape reality, they were trying to merge with it. Which is a poetic way of saying, let's get high enough to think the universe is our roommate. Still, the early Chinese were far too organized to let things spiral. Cannabis was carefully measured, blended with other herbs, and documented on scrolls that probably smelled faintly of smoke and regret. You didn't just light up, you followed the procedure, meditated, and hoped not to levitate into a wall. Meanwhile, the Confucians, history's eternal killjoys, disapproved of anything that loosened the mind too much. The Taoists claimed cannabis expanded consciousness. The Confucians said it expanded laziness. It was humanity's first recorded drug policy debate, and like every one that followed, it ended with everyone pretending to agree, then doing whatever they wanted at home. Through it all, cannabis remained the quiet companion of China's mystics, burned in temples, studied by scholars, and probably blamed for at least one missing manuscript. Somehow, the Chinese managed to turn getting high into a moral, philosophical, and bureaucratic process. Only in China could you inhale the cosmos, but make sure you fill out the correct form first. By now, cannabis had fully earned its place in human civilization. Not just as a mystical herb or a shady indulgence, but as the overachieving plant no one could get rid of. You could smoke it, wear it, write on it, build with it, and, if times got rough, probably eat it. It was the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world, except instead of opening bottles, it occasionally opened minds a little too far. In ancient China, hemp wasn't just useful, it was everywhere. Farmers cultivated it in vast fields, villagers spun it into thread, and scribes turned it into paper. The world's earliest texts were written on hemp, meaning that human civilization was, quite literally, recorded on weed. Somewhere in ancient China, a Taoist monk was probably inhaling the same plant another monk was writing, "Stop inhaling this one." Hemp's fibers were legendary, strong, durable, and practically immortal. Its ropes held up fishing nets, tied ships together, and occasionally restrained the same philosophers who'd gotten a little too metaphysical after sampling the other half of the plant. Clothing made from hemp lasted longer than most marriages and was only slightly less comfortable. And it didn't stop there. Archaeologists have uncovered hemp sandals, bowstrings, even armor padding, because nothing says battle-ready quite like a soldier dressed head to toe in cannabis. Somewhere out there, an army likely marched into war completely wrapped in hemp, history's first all-natural dispensary on legs. As the plant spread west along ancient trade routes, it conquered new continents without ever lifting a leaf. The Persians twisted it into rope, the Egyptians brewed it into ointments, and the Greeks, naturally, debated its moral implications over wine. Everyone used it. Everyone needed it. And everyone quietly ignored how suspiciously cheerful their weavers always seemed. Hemp had become the silent empire builder. It needed no swords or armies, just strength, flexibility, and a faint, herbal scent that lingered for centuries. While kings fought over gold, hemp sat in the corner, patient, waiting for humanity to remember it existed. And eventually, we did, not for rope, not for scrolls, but for smoke. The era of practicality was ending. The age of recreational enlightenment was about to begin. By the time cannabis drifted into ancient Persia, it had already been medicine, rope, and incense. The Persians took one look at this miraculous plant and, being Persians, decided it should probably teach them something about the universe. Because in this part of the world, even getting high came with a reading list. The Assyrians were among the first to use it regularly, calling it konubu, which sounds suspiciously like cannabis because, well, it is. They burned it in temples not for fun, but for a divine insight, which is ancient priests speak for, we're about to smell colors. When cannabis reached the Persians proper, it found eager hosts in Zoroastrian mystics, people who already had fire altars, cosmic dualism, and chronic existential dread. All they were missing was a good mood enhancer. They believed the smoke carried prayers to the heavens, which, to be fair, it did, along with a few brain cells. Then came the philosophers. Persia had no shortage of people who loved sitting cross-legged and debating metaphysics until everyone forgot what the question was. Cannabis fit right in. It dulled pain, softened reality's edges, and made endless discussions about the nature of truth almost tolerable. Ancient accounts mention priests who used it in rituals to free the mind from doubt. Modern translation, suddenly, everything made perfect sense. But not everyone approved. As usual, the ruling class caught wind of the idea and panicked. If people could reach the divine without paying temple fees, civilization might crumble. And so began cannabis's long career as a suspicious substance, respected in private, condemned in public, and quietly passed around behind the incense burner. Persian traders carried it west along the Silk Road, where it gathered new names, new rituals, and a growing reputation for philosophical chaos. By the time it reached Greece, it wasn't just a plant anymore, it was a traveling idea, a portable enlightenment kit with no instructions. So yes, Persia made cannabis philosophical, and, in a way, gave it its first identity crisis. They turned smoke into spirit, contemplation into a contact sport, and a plant into a debate partner. And like all great philosophical discussions, it ended the same way, with someone eventually asking, "Wait, what were we talking about again?" By the time cannabis floated down the Nile, Egypt was already running on divine bureaucracy. The gods had job titles, the priests had paperwork, and everyone was building pyramids without anything resembling labor laws. Into this grand celestial office came cannabis, a small mercy for a civilization that had been overworked for roughly 3,000 years. The Egyptians, ever practical, didn't throw wild smoke parties like the Taoists or drink bang like the Indians. They used cannabis medically, which is to say, they called it medicine and then prescribed it for absolutely everything. It shows up in the Ebers Papyrus, a 3,500-year-old medical text listing it as a cure for inflammation, glaucoma, menstrual pain, and, genuinely, bad temper. That last one alone could have saved several pharaohs from a few wars. Priests were the main gatekeepers of cannabis use. They blended it into oils, balms, and incense for temple rituals. Picture a high priest waving a censer of fragrant smoke while declaring it purely spiritual. Sure, and so is tequila. The idea was that the sweet scent carried prayers to the gods, and probably made everyone in the temple feel a little closer to them, in more ways than one. Cannabis even followed Egyptians into the afterlife. Traces have been found in mummy wrappings and burial chambers, proof that someone thought, if I'm crossing into eternity, I'm bringing a joint. Hard to argue. Eternity sounds long, and the afterlife allegedly involved farming again. Women also used it. Ancient Egyptian midwives prescribed cannabis to ease childbirth, a bold move considering there were no epidurals, only divine chanting and whatever herbs you could sneak past the temple guard. You can almost hear the advice, breathe, my queen, and pass the oil. Even the nobility indulged. Pharaohs loved their luxuries, and cannabis ointments soothed royal migraines, possibly caused by the crushing weight of the crown or yet another meeting about pyramid deadlines. In short, the Egyptians didn't just build monuments, they built coping mechanisms. Cannabis wasn't rebellion, it was survival. When your gods demand perfection, your climate demands sweat, and your workers keep fainting in the sun, a little green plant starts to look like divine intervention. By the time cannabis reached ancient Greece, the locals had already perfected two national pastimes, arguing and drinking. Naturally, a plant that encouraged both introspection and mild chaos fit right in. The Greeks didn't invent cannabis use, they just intellectualized it, as they did with everything else. To them, nothing was sacred until it had been debated, categorized, and turned into a symposium topic. Thus began the great philosophical relationship between weed and wisdom, or, as Plato might have called it, the Republic of Chill. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Dioscorides wrote about cannabis in their medical texts, praising its ability to treat inflammation, earaches, and pain of the inner self, which may have been the first recorded diagnosis of existential dread. They weren't exactly rolling joints under the Acropolis, but it's safe to say the stuff was around, probably discussed in that serious, poetic tone that made every statement sound profound. Picture a symposium, a smoky room, cups of wine, half a dozen philosophers reclining on couches, and one of them musing, "My friends, what if reality is an illusion?" A pause, a nod. A debate begins. Someone coughs in the corner after inhaling a little too much medicinal incense. To the Greeks, cannabis wasn't scandalous, it was natural. It grew freely, healed wounds, and occasionally caused the kind of clarity that ruins friendships. Soldiers used hemp to bind their injuries, while thinkers used it to unravel logic itself. Everyone had an angle. Even Herodotus, the ancient world's first travel blogger, wrote about the Scythians and their joyous vapors. The Greeks admired them, of course, but, in classic Greek fashion, pretended they were above such indulgences. It's like how modern people admire yoga retreats but never actually go. It's not that Greek philosophers needed cannabis to think deeply, they were already professionals at questioning everything: gods, morals, politics, and why sandals hurt so much. Cannabis just made those questions feel profoundly important. Somewhere, as Athens debated the meaning of virtue, a lesser-known philosopher was probably staring at an olive tree for 2 hours whispering, "I think it understands me." And honestly, that's about as Greek as it gets. When the Roman Empire wasn't busy conquering people, it was busy conquering their stuff, food, gods, languages, and naturally, cannabis. The plant slipped into Rome quietly, hitching a ride along the trade routes and never leaving. The Romans didn't spiritualize it like the Indians or philosophize about it like the Greeks. They just used it, complained about it, and wrote manuals about it. To Rome, cannabis was practical. Its fibers became ropes, sails, and tents, essential gear for an empire that simply couldn't stop invading places. Hemp ropes hauled ships across the Mediterranean, tied prisoners together, and occasionally doubled as laundry lines for togas soaked in regret. If Rome had a cannabis motto, it might have been Veni, Vidi, vaped. Doctors loved it too. Dioscorides, yes, the same Greek physician Rome borrowed, like everything else, recommended cannabis for earaches, gout, and joint pain, which was fitting for an empire full of sore soldiers and tired senators. It was also said to reduce sexual desire, which instantly made it the least popular prescription in the Senate. Roman women, ever resourceful, found their own use for cannabis. They infused it into oils and creams, swearing it softened the skin and soothed female complaints. Given the state of Roman plumbing and diet, that was probably the kindest thing their bodies experienced all year. But don't picture marble statue stoners lounging around the forum. For Romans, intoxication was a moral issue. Wine was civilized, hashish was suspicious. Anything that made you too happy without taxation was a threat to order. So while hemp was everywhere, in ropes, scrolls, and sails, actually smoking it was reserved for foreigners, mystics, and that one uncle who wouldn't stop talking about the stars. Still, the plant spread through the empire like gossip in a bathhouse. Roman soldiers carried hemp seeds to every corner of their conquests, unknowingly turning half of Europe into potential farmland for the world's most adaptable weed. From Britain to North Africa, cannabis took root quietly and stubbornly, like every idea Rome tried and failed to suppress. While emperors toasted with wine and philosophers debated virtue, humble hemp was literally holding the empire together, in sails, ropes, and parchment. Rome eventually fell, but cannabis didn't. It simply waited, patient and green, for the next empire to take credit for discovering it. By the time the Silk Road hit its golden age, cannabis had achieved what every empire dreamed of: global domination without a single battle. No armies, no borders, just chill merchants spreading good vibes and better hemp. Picture it, a caravan winding through the deserts of Central Asia. Camels groaning, traders sweating, spices perfuming the air, and somewhere in the back, a sack of cannabis seeds labeled for medicinal purposes. It was the ancient world's version of a carry-on excuse. Along these routes, the plant became a shapeshifter. In China, it was medicine and paper. In India, sacred. In Persia, wisdom in smoke form. And by the time it reached the Middle East and Africa, it had transformed again, into hashish, portable, potent, and infinitely more fun than most religions allowed. Merchants didn't just trade silk and spices, they traded culture. Every stop along the route became a swap meet of ideas, languages, and the occasional aromatic haze. Sanskrit hymns mingled with Persian poetry, while someone in the corner accidentally reinvented hotboxing. Then came the legends, the assassins of Alamut, a secretive Persian sect said to use hashish before carrying out political killings. European chroniclers, equal parts fascinated and terrified, spread the story. In reality, they probably just liked the hash and were very good at stabbing. Still, the myth endured, and hashin eventually morphed into our modern word assassin, a linguistic masterpiece born of paranoia and bad PR. Further west, Arab physicians documented cannabis in medical texts, calling it both a cure for melancholy and a threat to discipline, which, to be fair, still sums it up pretty well. As for the traders themselves, they discovered an eternal truth of commerce: people will always pay extra for anything that helps them forget they're riding a camel for 9 months straight. The Silk Road turned cannabis into humanity's first truly multicultural plant. It crossed languages, religions, and moral codes with ease, uniting monks, merchants, and mystics under one hazy banner. Whether you were meditating in China, bargaining in Samarkand, or philosophizing in Cairo, the scent was the same: smoke, dust, and mild enlightenment. Cannabis had gone viral, and there was no logging off. By the time the Islamic Golden Age dawned, cannabis had become the polite guest nobody admitted to inviting but everyone quietly let stay. From Baghdad to Cairo, it drifted through mosques, palaces, and poetry circles, never loudly discussed, yet always present. This was an age of brilliance, algebra, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and a plant that made all of them just a little more interesting. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi mentioned cannabis in their medical texts, describing it as useful for pain, digestion, and calming the spirit, which was medieval code for take one and stop arguing about theology for 5 minutes. But Islam's relationship with intoxication was complicated. The Quran forbade alcohol, clear enough, but it never specifically mentioned cannabis. That left a loophole, and wherever a loophole exists, humans are quick to crawl through it. Enter hashish, the original gray area of divine law. The Sufi mystics, Islam's spiritual poets and dancers, embraced it wholeheartedly. These were the people spinning themselves into trances, chanting about divine love, and occasionally indulging in substances that made God seem unusually conversational. For them, cannabis wasn't a sin, it was a bridge, a fragrant, slightly giggly connection to the divine. Meanwhile, the religious establishment panicked. Hashish dens began appearing from Egypt to Persia, filled with scholars, traders, and people who were definitely supposed to be somewhere else. Authorities called it a moral plague. Preachers denounced it as the herb of idleness. And yet, every crackdown failed, partly because the enforcers kept confiscating the evidence for testing purposes. By the 13th century, hashish had become the era's open secret, condemned from the pulpit, enjoyed in private, and woven into the daily rhythm of the Islamic world. It was no longer just a plant, it was a quiet rebellion, a whisper of freedom in an age of faith, science, and smoke. Poets praised it, rulers banned it, doctors prescribed it, and beggars smoked it. Everyone had an opinion, and half of them forgot what it was mid-sentence. While Europe was busy burning witches and bathing occasionally, the Islamic world was locked in an eternal debate. Did cannabis bring you closer to God, or just closer to a nap? Either way, it fueled one of history's most creative eras, and quite possibly, one of its most relaxed. But somewhere in the jagged mountains of 11th century Persia, cannabis got its first major PR disaster. The legend begins with the Nizari Ismailis, a secretive sect that built fortresses, defied empires, and occasionally removed political obstacles with precision. Their leader, Hassan I Sabah, ruled from Alamat, the eagle's nest, which sounded far nobler than Mountain Murder HQ. According to medieval gossip, his followers, the Hashishin, smoked hashish before carrying out assassinations, moving in a blissful haze of divine purpose. Chroniclers claimed the drug made them fearless, devoted, and very stabby. It was a sensational tale, and almost certainly nonsense. In truth, there's no evidence the Nizaris ever used hashish in their missions. The story was likely fabricated by enemies who needed a comforting explanation for how a few mountain zealots kept humiliating vast empires. Blaming drugs was easier than admitting they were simply better strategists. "They're not geniuses, they're high," became the medieval version of political spin. But the rumor spread faster than a crusader's sunburn. Returning knights whispered about Eastern assassins intoxicated by strange herbs. The Arabic word hashishin mutated through languages until it became assassin. And just like that, a drug, a religion, and a tactic fused into one lasting myth, a headline that survived for nearly 900 years. Ironically, the Nizaris were more scholars than stoners. They built libraries, negotiated treaties, and only killed people when absolutely necessary, which, to be fair, was still pretty often. The idea that they got high before missions probably came from the same chroniclers who thought Ethiopia had dragons. But the damage was done. Hashish became synonymous with shadowy violence, all thanks to medieval gossip and zero fact-checking. By the time cannabis floated into medieval Europe, the continent had perfected its system for handling new ideas, fear them, ban them, and then quietly use them anyway. Hemp had long been a staple for rope, oil, and cloth, no controversy there. But the moment someone decided to smoke it instead of spin it, the church got involved. To be fair, Europe wasn't in the mood for experimentation. Between crusades, famines, and the occasional plague wiping out a third of the population, people were barely holding it together. The church controlled everything: law, medicine, and your odds of eternal happiness, and it was not thrilled about peasants giggling during sermons. Still, cannabis found a way. Monks grew hemp in monastery gardens for parchment and prayer ropes, all while condemning sinful herbs in their writings. It's safe to assume at least one monk sampled the product and had a profound revelation involving a candle flame and 37 Gregorian chants. By the 13th century, doctors and apothecaries were quietly prescribing cannabis oil for pain, fever, and what they delicately called female complaints. It worked, which made it suspicious. Anything that cured suffering without divine approval raised eyebrows, and usually torches. The church preferred its miracles to come from heaven, not from someone's backyard. Meanwhile, travelers returning from the Crusades brought tales of strange Eastern pleasures, dimly lit hashish dens where people lounged peacefully instead of stabbing each other. Naturally, Europe was horrified. Chroniclers described Saracens who smoke madness into their souls. Translation: they looked relaxed, which could only mean evil was afoot. Soon enough, cannabis joined the ever-growing list of things the church disapproved of, alongside pagan rituals, heresy, women reading, and good moods. Officially, it was declared the devil's herb. Unofficially, it remained a quiet staple for midwives, herbalists, and anyone with back pain and a realistic sense of God's priorities. Thus, Europe turned a harmless, versatile plant into a moral panic, a talent it has never quite lost. Hemp stayed respectable as long as it behaved itself. But the moment it hinted at pleasure, it was excommunicated. And so began Europe's oldest and most consistent tradition, being terrified of and dependent on the same thing. By the late Middle Ages, cannabis had done what most humans couldn't: survive everything. Empires rose and fell, languages shifted, cities burned, and yet the same stubborn green plant kept growing wherever people were stressed and dirt existed. Hemp became indispensable, woven into ropes, sails, paper, and clothing. The entire age of exploration was basically held together by weed, not the fun kind, but the kind that kept ships from falling apart. Columbus himself wouldn't have reached the New World without hemp rigging, hemp caulking, and, quite possibly, hemp underwear. In a strange way, cannabis accidentally discovered America. Still, its reputation remained divided. To the working class, it was a useful crop. To doctors, a legitimate medicine. To the church, yet another moral threat. Every class needed it, hated it, or both, which is more or less the story of civilization itself. By the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered curiosity and began dissecting everything from theology to cadavers, cannabis quietly crept back into medicine. Apothecaries sold it for pain, seizures, and sleeplessness. Poets slipped references to it into verse. And while the church still officially frowned on pleasure, Europe had just invented gin, so moral outrage was becoming increasingly flexible. Then came the age of empire. Cannabis crossed oceans once again, this time in cargo holds. The Spanish planted it in the Americas, the Portuguese carried it to Africa, and the British industrialized it. Every empire claimed it was cultivating a useful agricultural resource, which is history's polite way of saying, we're cashing in. By the 19th century, cannabis had completed its wild transformation, from sacred to scandalous to scientific. Victorians used it in tinctures to soothe nerves, ease sleep, and calm hysteria, all while ignoring the fact that half of polite society was addicted to laudanum. Doctors prescribed it. Artists painted it. Everyone else quietly pretended not to enjoy it.